The question left my mouth with a calmness I hadn't expected, even from myself. It was a Thursday afternoon, the kind of late autumn day in London where the sky hung low and grey, promising a drizzle that never quite materialised. I had just navigated the labyrinthine aisles of the organic market, my reusable bags heavy with heirloom tomatoes, artisanal bread, and a bottle of a particularly robust Chianti I'd been saving for a quiet evening. My apartment, a cherished sanctuary on the sixth floor of a Victorian conversion in Islington, felt miles away as I wrestled with the grocery haul. Pushing open the heavy oak door of my flat, the familiar scent of old books and dried lavender should have enveloped me. Instead, a faint, unfamiliar perfume, something sweet and cloying, hit me first. Then, there she was. Genevieve, my daughter-in-law, standing in the exact center of my living room, as if she owned the very air she breathed. Two enormous designer suitcases, gleaming in an obnoxious shade of rose gold, sat at her feet like loyal sentinels. Her expression, usually an impeccably curated mask of polished confidence, was a bizarre cocktail of surprise, annoyance, and something almost resembling guilt. As if my arrival had somehow inconvenienced her perfectly orchestrated moment, she looked up, her perfectly arched brows lifting fractionally. Her eyes, framed by a subtle flick of liquid liner, blinked twice. Then she let out that awkward, high-pitched laugh she always used when cornered. A short, sharp exhalation designed to make the other person feel utterly ridiculous for daring to confront her. But I didn't look away. I stood there, rooted in the doorway of my own home, the heavy bags cutting angry red lines into my forearms, waiting for an answer she clearly hadn't prepared. "Hi, Eleanor. I didn't hear you come in." Her voice, light and almost musical, floated through the air. It was a practiced nonchalance, as if we were discussing the merits of a new art exhibition, as if the rose-gold monoliths at her feet didn't exist, as if it were completely normal for her to be in my apartment on a Thursday afternoon without a single call, a single text, a single flicker of consideration for the fact that this was my space, my sanctuary, the one place in the world where I could still breathe without anyone demanding a piece of me. I didn't move. The weight of the bags grew unbearable, but I held on. Something inside me had hardened the exact moment my gaze landed on those ostentatious suitcases. Something that had been soft, yielding, pliable for years, always ready to bend, to accommodate, to sacrifice, had just found its unyielding limit. "Did you ask the owner of this house for permission, Genevieve?" My voice was firmer this time, cutting through her manufactured airiness. She tucked a perfectly highlighted strand of hair behind her ear, a familiar gesture. It was her tell, the little tick she employed when she needed a millisecond to construct a plausible lie, or at least a highly sanitized version of the truth. Her eyes, lined with a light shadow that matched the silken blouse draped effortlessly over her slender frame, darted away from mine for a fleeting second, before returning with that small, condescending smile I so detested. "Eleanor, please don't overreact. Marcus and I just need to stay for a few days. They're doing renovations on our flat, and the noise is unbearable. The contractors start at 6 in the morning and don't leave until 7 at night. We can't sleep. We can't work. We simply can't live like this. We thought it wouldn't be a problem to come here. After all, you live alone, and you have 2 rooms you don't even use." There it was. That exquisitely crafted sentence, honed over years of implicit assumptions, which encapsulated precisely what my family thought of me. You live alone, and you have space you don't use. As if my entire existence were an empty vessel, waiting to be filled by the convenient overflow of other people's needs. As if the quiet stillness of unoccupied rooms automatically transformed my home into a communal resource, perpetually available to anyone who required it. As if my 68 years of navigating this complex world didn't grant me the fundamental right to decide how, when, and with whom I shared my most intimate space. I finally stepped fully into the apartment, the oak door thudding shut behind me with a decisive finality. I walked past Genevieve, past the gleaming suitcases, and dropped the grocery bags onto the polished surface of my antique dining table. The sound of the glass bottle of Chianti clinking against the wooden surface, the soft thump of canned goods, resonated louder than I expected in the sudden quiet. Genevieve took a minute step back, barely perceptible, but I noticed it. Her carefully constructed composure was cracking. The discomfort, like a subtle stain, was beginning to filter through that polished mask of certainty she always wore. I stood by the table, my hands resting on the smooth wood, without making any move to put away the groceries, without moving toward the kitchen as I normally would have. I could feel the frantic thrum of my own pulse beating in my fingertips. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It wasn't nervousness in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something akin to the feeling of reaching a precipice, a point of no return. "Does Marcus know you're here?" The question was rhetorical. I already knew the answer, or at least I had a very strong suspicion. But I needed to hear it. I needed to confirm what I already suspected, that my son, my only son, had allowed this, that he had been an active participant in this plan from the very beginning, that they had both, in their collective wisdom, decided my consent was an inconvenient formality, entirely unnecessary. Genevieve let out a long theatrical sigh, a carefully orchestrated performance of exasperation, as if I were the one being unreasonably difficult. "Of course, he knows, Eleanor. It was his idea, actually. He's just finishing up some things at the office and is coming later with the rest of our stuff. I thought he would have called you to let you know." "He didn't call you?" "No, he didn't call me." And that silence, that profound absence of a simple phone call, spoke volumes, communicating everything I needed to know without a single uttered word. My son, Marcus. The boy I had raised alone, single-handedly, after his father, a fleeting shadow in our lives, had vanished when Marcus was just 7 years old. The same Marcus I had fed, clothed, and educated with the meager earnings from my double shifts, cleaning offices by night, serving coffee by day. The same Marcus who, as a small boy, would wrap his arms around my neck and whisper promises of taking care of me forever. That very same son now found it perfectly acceptable to orchestrate a move into my home without a hint of consultation, as if I were merely an extension of his convenience, a resource at his unquestioning disposal. I walked toward the suitcases, the rose-gold behemoths that now seemed to mock me from the middle of my living room. I stood in front of them, scrutinizing them as if they were strange, alien objects, recently fallen from another planet. They were undeniably expensive, one of those flashy brands Genevieve often flaunted on her meticulously curated social media feeds. Shiny, new, probably purchased during one of those frequent, extravagant trips they took every other month, while I was still making do with the same worn, reliable suitcase I had bought 15 years ago at a clearance sale. "And you both thought this was acceptable, Genevieve? Showing up at my house with your belongings, without asking me if I agreed, without even considering for a moment that perhaps I had other plans, that perhaps I value my privacy, that perhaps I don't want people living here." Genevieve crossed her arms defensively over her chest. Her posture shifted, the relaxed nonchalance melting away, replaced by an unmistakable defensiveness in every taut line of her body. "Eleanor, you're Marcus's mother. We're family. I don't understand why you're making this so complicated. It's just for a few days, maybe a week. It's not like we're asking you for something impossible. Besides, I thought you'd be happy to have company. You always say this house feels empty." Empty. That single word reverberated in my head, echoing with the chilling finality of a funeral bell. Yes, I had mentioned, once, fleetingly, that the house sometimes felt quiet after my sister Clara had moved in with her daughter last year, filling the space with their vibrant energy before finding her own place. But there was a colossal, unbridgeable chasm between quiet and empty. My house was quiet by my deliberate choice. Because after decades of unrelenting noise, of incessant demands, of being perpetually available for everyone else but myself, I had finally, gloriously found peace in the stillness. But Genevieve, with her characteristic talent for selective listening, had seized upon that casual confession, twisting it into a convenient justification. As if my moment of vulnerability, my fleeting admission of a human emotion, somehow granted her carte blanche to invade my space. As if acknowledging that I sometimes felt lonely was tantamount to a desperate plea for someone to come and fill every corner of my life without the slightest courtesy of an invitation. Listen to me carefully, Genevieve. My voice was low, almost a whisper, but infused with an ironclad resolve. Genevieve stopped moving. Something in my tone, a new, unyielding quality, made her truly pay attention for the first time since she had arrived. This house can feel however it wants to feel to me. It can be quiet, or it can be full of noise. It can be empty, or it can be complete. But what it will never, ever be is available for anyone to use without my explicit permission. I am the owner of this house, Genevieve. Not a convenient option for when you have a problem. Not a free hotel. My house. She opened her mouth to reply, but at that exact moment, we heard the familiar click of a key in the lock. The door opened, and Marcus walked in, my son, carrying 2 more bags, his face sporting that carefree, boyish smile he always wore when he believed everything was perfectly under control. "Mom! Good thing you're already here. Genevieve explained it to you, right? We're just going to be here for a week, 2 maximum. You'll see. You won't even notice we're here. Won't even notice they're here." Marcus's words hung in the air, absurd in their casual dismissal of my entire existence, as if they were the most reasonable, self-evident statement in the world. He dropped the bags onto the polished wood floor next to the rose-gold suitcases, dusted his hands on his designer jeans, and looked at me with that infuriatingly familiar expression. It was the same face he had made when he was 12 years old, coming home late after a pickup basketball game with his friends, expecting me not to be angry because, after all, he was just being a normal boy. Except Marcus wasn't 12 years old anymore. He was 42, and I was no longer that young, perpetually exhausted mother who succumbed to every disarming smile because I was simply too tired to fight another battle. I stood by the dining room table, my hands still resting on the cool wood, watching him enter my apartment as if it were his own undisputed territory, as if the last 40 years hadn't passed, as if continuing to be his mother automatically meant I had relinquished any expectation of basic respect or consideration. Marcus walked closer, his intent clear. He leaned in, attempting to give me a customary kiss on the cheek. I didn't move. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean toward him either. I remained exactly where I was, a silent, unyielding monument. He must have sensed something in my posture, an invisible barrier, because he stopped halfway, a flicker of confusion briefly crossing his face, before being quickly replaced by a wider, more forced smile. "What's wrong, Mum? Did you have a bad day? A bad day?" As if my reaction was merely the product of a passing mood. As if the problem was that I had endured a particularly long queue at the bank, or that London traffic had been exceptionally heavy. Not that my son and daughter-in-law had made the executive decision to move into my home without so much as a preceding conversation. Not that they had treated me as if my opinion were utterly irrelevant. Not that they had simply assumed that my life, my space, my hard-won peace were readily available resources for their convenience. I didn't have a bad day, Marcus. I had a profoundly unpleasant surprise arriving home, and finding your wife settling in here without anyone asking me if I was okay with it." Marcus let out a short, genuine laugh, a burst of incredulity, as if he had just heard a truly amusing anecdote. He ran a hand through his carefully styled hair, that familiar gesture he employed when he thought someone was dramatically overreacting, and shook his head. "Mum, please don't be dramatic. I called you twice this morning, and you didn't answer. I thought you were out, and that we could just get settled while you were gone. It's not a big deal." I looked over at Genevieve, who was now standing next to the burgeoning pile of suitcases, her arms still crossed over her chest, observing the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and something that looked dangerously like satisfaction. As if my confrontation with Marcus was conveniently proving something she had long suspected, that I was difficult, that I was unreasonable, that I was the stubborn obstacle in a situation that, to her, should have been utterly simple. "You called twice, Marcus, and when I didn't answer, you decided that was sufficient authorization to move into my house." "We're not moving in, Mum. We're just staying for a few days." Marcus, with an astonishing display of casual entitlement, walked toward the kitchen, opened the refrigerator I had just stocked, and without a moment's hesitation, took out a bottle of sparkling water I had bought that very afternoon. He uncapped it and drank directly from the bottle. That small gesture, so utterly insignificant to any outside observer, felt like a thunderous confirmation of everything I had been thinking. He genuinely saw no distinction between his space and mine. To him, my house was merely an extension of his. My refrigerator, my food, my privacy. Everything was part of a shared, undifferentiated territory where he had unlimited, unquestioned access. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, pressing my thumb and forefinger against my temples, trying to control the pressure I felt building in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was something deeper, far older. It was the accumulated weight of decades of being the person who always yielded, who always understood, who always placed the needs of others so far before her own that her own needs had become invisible, even to herself. It was the sheer exhaustion of having spent my entire adult life being useful, available, convenient for everyone, except myself. "How many days is a few days, Marcus?" My voice, when it came, was laced with a weariness that surprised even me. He shrugged, still drinking from the bottle, his gaze avoiding mine. "A week, 2 maximum. The contractors said they'd finish quickly. It's just until we can sleep in our own bed again without waking up to the sound of drills at 6 in the morning. 2 weeks. 14 days of having 2 other people occupying my space, using my bathroom, consuming my food, disrupting the carefully calibrated rhythm of my routine. 14 days of not being able to walk in my pajamas through my own living room if I woke up thirsty in the middle of the night. 14 days of having to factor in other people's schedules before deciding if I could watch my favorite documentary series or listen to my classical music. 14 days of giving up the hard-won peace that had cost me so much to build after years of noise and chaos. And you simply assumed I would be okay with that. Marcus finally capped the water bottle, its gentle click loud in the quiet room, and looked at me with an expression that attempted to convey patience, but was thinly disguised condescension. "Mum, you're my mother." "Of course. I assumed you would be okay with it. What did you want us to do? Stay in a hotel and spend £150 per night when you have 2 perfectly empty rooms here? That doesn't make sense. £150 per night. There it was. The real truth, stark and unadorned. It wasn't about them needing me, not truly. It wasn't about them craving quality time or seeking my company. It was about money, about economic convenience. The undeniable fact that utilizing my apartment for free made infinitely more sense than paying for their own temporary comfort. And I, as always, was expected to understand, to be reasonable, to quietly subsume my emotional well-being beneath their practical financial needs. Genevieve cleared her throat from her spot beside the suitcases. When she spoke, her voice had adopted that soft, conciliatory tone, the one people employ when they want to appear eminently reasonable while deftly manipulating a situation in their favor. Eleanor, we really don't want to cause you any trouble. If it is a problem, we can help with expenses. I don't know, maybe £50 extra for utilities. We'll be using water and electricity. It's only fair that we contribute. £50, as if the problem were merely the marginal cost of increased utility consumption. As if I could affix a monetary value to my privacy, to my routine, to the quiet mornings where I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and simply existed, without having to be a mother-in-law, a hostess, or any other role that others implicitly or explicitly needed me to play. It's not about money, Genevieve. My voice came out more tired, more defeated than I had intended. Marcus approached again, this time placing a hand on my shoulder, with that familiar gesture he had used 1,000 times to soften me, to disarm me. Then what is it about, Mum? Just tell me what's bothering you and we'll fix it. You want us to buy the groceries? Perfect. No problem. You want us to clean everything before we leave? We can do that too. You want us to be quiet in the mornings? We'll be quiet as mice. Tell me what you need and we'll do it. And what I needed was for them to have asked me beforehand. What I needed was for them to have considered, for even a fleeting moment, that perhaps I had the fundamental right to say no. What I needed was for them to truly understand that being family didn't automatically confer unlimited access to every aspect of my life without my explicit consent. But how could I articulate that without sounding like the selfish mother, the difficult mother-in-law, the unreasonable woman who stubbornly refused to help her own family in a time of need? The labels were already forming in my mind, a familiar and oppressive weight. I gently moved Marcus's hand from my shoulder. Not abruptly, not with anger, but firmly enough for him to unmistakably understand that the gesture was not welcome, not right now. What I need, Marcus, is for you to understand that this is my house. Not a hotel, not a backup option, not a resource available every time you have an inconvenience. It's the place where I live, where I rest, where I have the absolute right to decide who comes in and who stays. But we're your family, Mum! His response was immediate, almost automatic, delivered with the absolute conviction that those 4 words constituted an irrefutable argument, an unassailable truth. As if the simple fact of sharing blood automatically nullified any expectation of respect, any need for basic consideration. And maybe, for a very long time, I had believed that myself. Maybe for years, I had quietly accepted that being family meant always being available, always understanding, always willing to sacrifice my own needs for theirs. But something profound had changed. Perhaps it was turning 68 and acutely realizing that time was no longer an infinite, boundless commodity. Perhaps it was the death of my dear friend Beatrice last year, who spent her final days regretting every moment she hadn't truly lived for herself. Perhaps it was simply the accumulated, crushing exhaustion of decades of being invisible in my own life. Precisely because you are my family, Marcus, is why this hurts more, I stated, my voice quivering slightly despite my resolve. Because I would expect you, more than anyone, to understand that I also have a right to my space, my peace, my decisions. Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Genevieve. It was fleeting, barely a second, but I caught it. It was that silent, knowing look couples share when they feel they're dealing with someone inherently difficult, when they instinctively need to stand united against what they perceive as a common problem. And in that precise moment, I was undeniably the problem. Marcus let out a long, put-upon sigh. one of those deep exhalations he used when he felt a conversation was taking an unacceptably long time to reach its inevitable, convenient conclusion. He ran both hands over his face, a gesture of barely contained frustration, and then looked at me with that carefully constructed expression he had perfected over the years, the patient son, stoically dealing with his undeniably complicated mother. "Look, Mum, I understand you're upset because we didn't give you more notice. You're right about that. It was a lapse, but we're already here. The suitcases are inside. Genevieve has already unpacked some things in the guest room. What do you want us to do now? Go look for a hotel at 6 in the evening on a Thursday when I have meetings starting at 7 in the morning tomorrow." There it was. The guilt, deftly presented not as a direct emotional appeal, but as a cascade of practical inconveniences that I would be causing if I stubbornly insisted on holding my ground. As if the mere fact that they had unilaterally begun to settle in without my permission now automatically obligated me to accept the situation. As if their sheer lack of foresight and planning somehow magically transformed into my problem to solve. I looked toward the hallway leading to the bedrooms. The guest room door was ajar, and from where I stood, I could clearly see a corner of the bed, already covered with what looked like clothes, casually spread out. Genevieve had said she had unpacked some things. She wasn't asking permission to stay. She was establishing territory. I walked toward that room. I heard Marcus's footsteps behind me, and then Genevieve's voice, low and indistinct, murmuring something to him that I couldn't quite decipher. I pushed the door completely open. What I saw confirmed my deepest suspicions. Not only were there clothes strewn across the bed, but toiletries were neatly lined up on the dresser. Genevieve's signature makeup bag lay open next to the mirror. 2 pairs of expensive shoes were arranged against the wall. A laptop was plugged into the only available outlet near the nightstand, its charger snaking across the antique bedside table. This wasn't the tentative preparation of someone planning to stay for a mere few days. This was the confident settling in of someone planning to set up for weeks, perhaps even months. I turned around to face Marcus, who had stopped in the doorway, his hands shoved into his pockets, watching me with a mixture of caution and defensiveness. "A week, you said?" He nodded, though his eyes briefly avoided mine before returning. "2 maximum, Mum, I told you." "And all this settling in," I gestured around the room, encompassing the laptop, the bath products, the clothes enough for a month, "is for 2 weeks." Marcus shrugged. That casual, dismissive gesture he used when he wanted to minimize something he knew was fundamentally important. "Genevieve needs to work from here, and obviously we brought what we needed to be comfortable. We weren't going to live out of a suitcase for 2 weeks. Comfortable." That word resonated in my head, a jarring discord. They needed to be comfortable. In my house, in my space, using my resources. And I apparently simply needed to be understanding. I left the room and returned to the living room, where Genevieve was now sitting in my favorite armchair, the one by the window. The armchair I had bought 3 years ago after saving meticulously for months, a reward for finally retiring. She had her phone in her hand, scrolling through the screen with the casual, absorbed concentration of someone with no immediate worries. When she heard me enter, she looked up and offered another one of those small, practiced smiles. "Eleanor, we really are going to be as little trouble as possible. You won't even notice we're here. I work online, so I'll be in the room most of the day. Marcus leaves early and comes back late. We can buy our own food if you want, or cook for the 3 of us. Whatever you prefer." Whatever I prefer? As if all these options she was so generously presenting were genuine. As if she were truly offering me decision-making power, and not simply variations of a situation I had never agreed to in the first place. I walked closer to the armchair where she was sitting. I didn't say anything immediately. I just stood there, looking down at her, waiting to see if she would understand what I was communicating without a single word. She blinked. The smile began to slowly fade, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. After a few uncomfortable seconds, she got up from the armchair with an awkward, jerky movement. "Sorry, did you want to sit here?" I didn't want to sit there. Not really. What I wanted was for her to understand, truly understand, that every square inch of this apartment was mine. That this armchair wasn't just an available seat for anyone who needed it, but the very place where I spent my quiet afternoons reading, where I sat with my morning coffee, watching the city wake up. The place where I had cried after Beatrice's funeral. The place where I had finally gathered the courage to quit that exhausting job at the coffee shop and embrace my retirement. Marcus entered the living room at that moment, and the palpable tension must have been visible, because he stopped halfway, his gaze darting between Genevieve and me, as if trying to assess the gravity of the situation. "Mum, can we talk for a moment? Just you and me," I nodded. Maybe a private conversation with my son, away from Genevieve's subtle reinforcement of his position, would allow him to truly hear what I was trying to say. We walked into the kitchen. Marcus leaned against the cool granite counter, crossed his arms, and looked at me with an expression that attempted to be serious, but primarily conveyed impatience. "Okay, Mum, talk. What's really bothering you? Because I feel like there's something more than just the fact that we didn't call you beforehand. There was something more." Of course, there was something more. But how could I explain to my son that what truly bothered me was the accumulation of years of feeling invisible? How could I tell him that this incident with the suitcases was only the most recent, most flagrant manifestation of a pattern that had been repeating itself for decades? "You bother me, Marcus." The words, when they came, felt like a release, raw and honest. "It bothers me that you grew up thinking my life is a resource, readily available when you need me, but never a priority when it comes to basic consideration." He frowned, genuinely confused, as if my words were a foreign language. "I don't understand what you mean by that. When was the last time you visited me without needing something from me?" The question came out before I could stop it. A sharp, unbidden truth. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again without producing any sound. He was searching his memory, desperately trying to conjure an example that would disprove my accusation. The fact that it took him so long to find one only confirmed my painful point. "Me, Mum. I come to see you often." His voice was rising now, defensive. "You come when you need me to look after your dog, Barnaby, because you're going out of town. You come when Genevieve is busy, and you need me to hold on to some important documents for a few days. You come when you've had a fight with her and need a place to crash for a night. You come when there are problems with the car and you need me to lend you money for the repair shop. But when was the last time you came just to ask me how I was? To spend an afternoon with me? To be interested in my life beyond what I can do for you?" "That's not fair, Mum." His voice had risen in volume, the defensive tone hardening. "I call you on the phone. I text you. I asked you last week if you wanted to go out to dinner with us. You invited me to dinner because it was Genevieve's birthday, and you needed someone else to help pay the check, and to fill an empty seat. You didn't invite me because you genuinely wanted my company. In fact, you barely spoke to me the entire dinner. The two of you spent the whole time discussing where you were going on holiday next month, while I sat there, quietly eating my salad, feeling like an afterthought. I didn't know you felt that way. Why didn't you say anything at the time?" His genuine confusion was almost disarming, almost enough to make me backtrack. "Because I never say anything, Marcus. Because I learned a long time ago that when I say something, when I express that I feel ignored or unvalued, you make me feel like I'm overreacting, that I'm too sensitive, that I should be grateful that you even included me. So I stopped saying things. I stopped expecting. I stopped believing that my presence in your lives was anything more than purely functional." He shook his head, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "This is ridiculous. You're turning this into something much bigger than it is. We just need to stay here for a few days. We're not trying to invade your life or make you feel bad. We just need temporary help with a housing issue. And did it not occur to you that maybe I have a life too? That maybe I had plans for these 2 weeks? That maybe I enjoy my routine and my privacy, and I don't want to give them up because you decided to remodel your apartment without considering alternatives? What plans, Mum? His tone was dismissive, almost mocking. What is it you do all day that is so important that you can't share your space with your own family? And there it was. The question that revealed exactly what he thought of my life. To Marcus, I didn't do anything important. I didn't have significant commitments. I just existed, a static, unmoving fixture in a state of constant availability, waiting for someone to need me to have purpose. I don't have to justify my days to you, Marcus. The simple fact that I want to be alone in my own house should be reason enough. Marcus let out a short, incredulous laugh, shaking his head as if dealing with something utterly absurd. He straightened up, no longer leaning casually against the counter, and looked at me with an expression that mixed disbelief with barely contained frustration. So, what you're saying's that you prefer to be alone than to help your own son? That your comfort is more important than your family's needs? I wasn't saying that. Or maybe I was, but not in the way he was interpreting it. It wasn't about choosing my comfort over their needs. It was about recognizing that my needs mattered too, that I also deserved to be considered, that my life wasn't a blank space, a tabula rasa, waiting to be filled by the urgencies of others. What I'm saying, Marcus, is that you should have asked me before assuming I would be available, that you should have given me the option to say yes or no, that you should have treated me with the same respect you would treat any other person you were asking for a huge favor. It's not a huge favor, Mum. It's letting your son sleep in your guest room for a few days. It's giving up my privacy for 2 weeks. It's changing my entire routine. It's sharing my bathroom, my kitchen, my living room, every space where I breathe. It's giving up the peace that cost me so much to achieve after years of living for everyone but myself. Marcus looked up at the ceiling, as if seeking divine patience from above, and then looked back at me with that tired expression he used when he felt someone was being unnecessarily complicated. You know what, Mum? I think the real problem here is that you've been alone too long. You've become selfish. I'm not saying this to hurt you, but it's the truth. You weren't like this before. Before, you always had your doors open for me, for anyone. Do you remember when you let my friend Julian live here for 3 months, when his parents kicked him out of the house? Do you remember when your sister Clara practically lived here for an entire year? You never said anything then. You never complained about your privacy or your routine. Of course, I remembered. I remembered Julian, who was 19 then, a gangly, heartbroken boy with nowhere to go after his father, furious at his academic failures, had thrown him out. I remembered quietly cleaning his dirty dishes every morning, doing his laundry because he never seemed to find the time, cooking for 2 even though I barely had enough money for 1. I remembered Clara, my older sister, who stayed with me after her devastating divorce, transforming my small apartment into her healing space while I kept working double shifts to keep both our precarious finances afloat. I remembered all of that, every exhausting, unacknowledged detail. And I also remembered how I felt during those periods, invisible, depleted, resentful, but utterly unable to express it because the people I loved, the people who needed me, were right there. And I had learned from a very young age that women like me existed to be needed, not to need. You're right, Marcus. I didn't say anything before. I used to swallow my discomfort and smile and pretend everything was fine while I faded away a little more each day. I used to believe that being a good mother, a good sister, a good person meant constantly sacrificing myself for others. But you know what? I got tired. I got tired of being the convenient solution to everyone's problems. I got tired of my generosity being taken for granted. I got tired of waiting for someone, sometime, to ask me what I needed. But we did ask you what you need, Mum. We just asked you a moment ago. We told you to tell us what you want us to do. His voice was escalating, ringing with indignation. You asked me what I wanted after. You had already made the decision for me. After you were already settled in. After. The situation was already in motion. That's not asking, Marcus. That's asking for retroactive permission, hoping I'll feel so guilty for saying no that I'll end up giving in anyway. I left the kitchen. I couldn't stay in that confined space with Marcus looking at me as if I were the problem, as if my resistance were a character flaw instead of a legitimate, long overdue boundary. I returned to the living room where Genevieve was now standing by the window, arms crossed, looking down at the busy London street. She turned when she heard me enter, and for the first time since her arrival, I saw something different in her expression. It wasn't the confident self-assurance from before. There was caution there now, maybe even a sliver of genuine worry. Marcus came out of the kitchen behind me, and the silence that filled the living room was so dense I could almost feel it pressing against my skin. None of the three of us spoke for a moment. We just stood there, forming an uncomfortable, charged triangle of accumulated tension. Finally, it was Genevieve who broke the silence. Her voice had lost that casual, confident lilt. Now it sounded more careful, as if she were choosing every word with meticulous precision. Eleanor, if you really don't want us to stay, we can find another solution. We truly don't want you to feel uncomfortable in your own house. I looked at Marcus, expecting him to immediately back up what his wife had just said. But he was looking away, his jaw tense, clearly annoyed at how this entire, supposedly simple situation was unfolding. And in that moment, I understood something I should have, perhaps understood years ago. My son wasn't going to defend me. He wasn't going to admit they had made a mistake. He wasn't going to validate my feelings or apologize for assuming my life was at their unquestioning disposal, because to him, I was still that mother who always said yes, that mother who moved mountains to make things easier for him, that mother whose love was measured in silent sacrifices and ignored needs. And any deviation from that ingrained pattern wasn't personal growth on my part, but a flaw that needed to be corrected, swiftly and decisively. I sat down in the armchair by the window, the one Genevieve had vacated just minutes ago. My legs felt suddenly heavy, weak. My whole body felt an almost bone-deep fatigue. In reality, it wasn't just the physical exhaustion from having hauled groceries or stood through this endless conversation. It was a deeper weariness, the kind that accumulates over decades of carrying the emotional weight of other people's lives, with no one ever offering to help lighten my own. I want you to explain something to me, I began, my voice clear despite the weariness. And I want an honest answer. Marcus finally looked at me, his arms crossed over his chest in a defensive posture. What do you want us to explain? If the situation were reversed, if I showed up at your apartment with my suitcases without notice, saying I needed to stay for 2 weeks because there was a problem with my building, would you welcome me without a second thought? I saw the exchange of glances between Marcus and Genevieve. It was quick, barely a second, but it was enough. They both knew the answer, and they both knew the answer was profoundly different from what they so easily expected from me. Genevieve cleared her throat, searching for the right words, for a diplomatic evasion. Well, we would have to think about it. Our apartment is smaller, and we both work from home now. It would be complicated with the space and exactly, it would be complicated. You would have to think about it. You would consider your needs, your space, your comfort, and you would be completely within your rights to do so. No one would judge you for protecting your privacy. No one would call you selfish for wanting to keep your routine intact. No one would expect you to sacrifice your peace of mind just because I'm family. But you're my mother, Mom. It's different. Marcus had taken a step toward me, his hands outstretched as if trying to explain something glaringly obvious that I was stubbornly refusing to grasp. Why is it different, Marcus? Does being your mother automatically mean I have less right to my own life? Does it mean my needs matter less than yours? Does it mean I can be ignored, invaded, taken for granted because my primary role is to serve you? I'm not saying that, his voice was sharp, but you are demonstrating it, Marcus. With every decision you make without consulting me, with every assumption that I'll be available, with every time you minimize how I feel because it doesn't align with what you need me to be. I got up from the armchair and walked toward the suitcases that were still by the entrance, glaring, rose gold symbols of contention. I looked at them as if seeing them for the first time, not just as physical, concrete objects, but as representations of something much larger. They embodied years of unestablished boundaries. They symbolized decades of implicitly teaching my son that my space was his space, that my time was his time, that my life was a shared resource he could take from without asking. And I had been the one who taught him that. I had created this pattern. For years I had prioritized being the perfect mother, the available mother, the mother who never said no, without realizing that in doing so, I was slowly but surely erasing any expectation of reciprocity or respect. Marcus approached, putting his hand on my shoulder again, more gently this time, a tentative olive branch. Mum, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We just want a place to sleep for a few days. We're not trying to take anything from you. But you are taking something from me, Marcus. You're taking away the ability to decide about my own life. You're taking away the right to say no without being punished with guilt. You're taking away the possibility of existing as something more than an extension of your needs. I pulled my shoulder away from his hand, not aggressively, but with an unwavering firmness that communicated the gesture was not welcome. This is my house, Marcus. I pay the rent. I pay the utilities. I decide who comes in. And right now, I'm deciding that I need you to leave. The silence that followed my words was so absolute that I could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen, a stark counterpoint to the suspended breath in the living room. Marcus stood completely motionless, his hand still suspended in the air where my shoulder had been, looking at me as if he hadn't fully understood what I had just said. Genevieve let out a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a disbelieving, choked laugh. What did you say? Marcus's voice sounded strange, higher pitched than usual, as if the words had gotten stuck somewhere between his throat and his mouth. He ran a hand over his face, took a deep, shuddering breath, and then looked at me with an intensity I hadn't seen in years. Mum, please tell me you're joking. I'm not joking. I need you to take your things and leave. Genevieve stepped forward, her hands raised in a gesture intended to be conciliatory, but which actually conveyed barely contained desperation. Eleanor, wait. We can talk about this. If we did something wrong, we can fix it. You don't have to kick us out. We're family. Family. That word again, thrown like a shield, used as an irrefutable justification, as if it were an automatic pass that annulled any need for basic respect. As if sharing blood meant I had to tolerate anything, accept any invasion, forgive any lack of consideration. Precisely because you are family is why this hurts so much, I repeated, my voice now steady, clear. Because I would expect you, more than anyone, to understand that I also deserve to be treated with dignity. Marcus let out another laugh, this time longer, sharper, laden not with amusement, but with disbelief and mounting rage. He turned around, walked a few steps toward the window, then returned, as if the physical movement helped him process the utterly unbelievable scenario unfolding before him. This is crazy. You're being completely irrational. Are you going to kick us out onto the street? Your own son? Why? Because we arrived a few hours before we could talk to you? Because we didn't follow some ridiculous protocol you just invented? I didn't just invent anything, Marcus. Asking before moving into someone's house isn't a ridiculous protocol. It's basic respect. It's what you would do with any other person in your life. It's what you would expect others to do with you. He shook his head, his hands on his hips, looking at me as if he were seeing a stranger, a completely unrecognizable person. I can't believe you're doing this after everything we've done for you. That sentence fell between us like a heavy stone in quiet water. Everything they had done for me. I waited for him to elaborate, to tell me specifically what that everything he was referring to was, but he didn't continue. He just stood there, breathing heavily, as if those words alone constituted an irrefutable argument. Everything you've done for me, I echoed, the phrase tasting bitter on my tongue. Tell me, Marcus, help me remember. What exactly have you done for me that justifies me having to give up my peace of mind? Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Genevieve, seeking support, but she was looking down at the floor, biting her lower lip. He looked back at me, and now there was something different in his expression. It was no longer just disbelief or frustration. There was anger there, genuine and rising, a red tide threatening to overflow. You want a list? Fine. We bought you that new television last year when yours broke down. I offered to pay you for it. You said it wasn't necessary, that it was a gift. And then you mentioned it at every family dinner for the next 6 months as an example of your boundless generosity. We took you to the doctor when you sprained your ankle, because I had no way to get there, and you were passing by here on your way home. And you dropped me off at the hospital entrance. You didn't go in with me. I waited 3 hours alone until a nurse got me a taxi to go back. We invite you out to dinner every time we celebrate something. You invite me when you need someone else to pay part of the bill, or when you need to look good in front of other people by showing your good children who include their mother. But at those dinners, you talk amongst yourselves, check your phones, make plans that don't include me. I'm just there as family decoration. Marcus took a step toward me, and there was something dangerous in his movement now. Not physically threatening, but laden with an emotion that was about to overflow, unchecked. You know what your problem is, Mum? That nothing anyone does for you is enough. There's always something wrong. There's always a but. You always find a way to make yourself the victim. I'm not making myself the victim, Marcus. I'm setting a boundary. There's a huge difference. No. What you're doing is punishing me because your life didn't turn out the way you wanted. Because Dad left. Because you had to work so hard. Because you feel lonely. And now when I finally have some stability, when I can finally ask you for a favor, you decide this is the perfect time to charge me emotional debts for things that happened decades ago. His words felt like physical blows, each one designed to hurt me, to make me doubt, to turn my legitimate boundary into an act of unjustified revenge. And the most painful, gut-wrenching part was that there was a fragment of truth in what he was saying. Yes, I felt lonely sometimes. Yes, I had carried resentments for years, a heavy, unseen burden. Yes, there were moments when I looked at my life and wondered where all the time had gone, all the energy, all the version of myself that existed before I became a mother, an employee, the person everyone needed me to be. But that didn't change the fundamental fact that I had a right to my space, that I deserved to be consulted, that my life wasn't a territory available for invasion just because my son decided he needed it. You're right about one thing, Marcus. My life didn't turn out the way I wanted. But you know what part didn't turn out the way I wanted? The part where I raised a son who sees me as a resource instead of a person. The part where I spent so many years being useful that I forgot how to be valued. The part where I convinced myself that love was measured in silent sacrifices and ignored needs. Genevieve intervened, her voice shaky but striving for an impossible reasonableness. "Eleanor, please, we understand you're upset. We understand we made a mistake by not consulting you first. But kicking Marcus out, kicking out your own son, is a disproportionate reaction. It's cruel, cruel." That word resonated in my head, a fresh wound. It was cruel to protect my space. It was cruel to set boundaries. It was cruel to say no. But it wasn't cruel to arrive unannounced. It wasn't cruel to assume my life was at their disposal. It wasn't cruel to minimize my feelings or treat me as invisible. The cruelty, it seemed, only went in one direction. You know what's truly cruel, Genevieve. Raising a son alone for decades, sacrificing every dream I had, working until my hands bled and my back could no longer straighten, all to make sure he had opportunities I never had. And then, when I finally have a little peace, a little space to breathe, discovering that to him, I'm just a convenience, a place to stay when it's cheaper than a hotel. Marcus had raised his voice now, and his cheeks were flushed red with contained, furious emotion. "I didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask for Dad to leave. I didn't ask for you to have to work so hard. Those were your decisions, your circumstances. You can't blame me for that now. I'm not blaming you for any of that, Marcus. I'm blaming you for not seeing that I am a person too, for treating me as if my only function is to make your life easier, for arriving here today and acting as if my consent didn't matter." He walked closer to the suitcases, grabbed one of them with more force than necessary, and looked at me with a mixture of pain and rage that made it difficult to hold his gaze. "You know what? You're right. We're leaving. I don't need this. I don't need to be in a place where I'm clearly not welcome, where my own mother treats me like a stranger. I'm not treating you like a stranger, Marcus. I'm treating you with the same standard you treat me, without prior consideration." Marcus lifted the suitcase, stumbling slightly with its weight, and headed toward the door. Genevieve followed him, taking the other suitcase, but before reaching the exit, she turned around to look at me one last time. "I hope this is worth it, Eleanor. I hope your space and your peace are worth losing your son." "My son isn't lost because I set a boundary. If he leaves and doesn't come back, it's because he chose to value his comfort more than our relationship. It's because he preferred to be angry than to be wrong." Marcus had already opened the door and was stepping out into the hallway when he suddenly stopped. He turned around, looked at me with a strange expression I couldn't immediately decipher, and then, to my complete surprise, he burst into laughter. It wasn't a joyful laugh. It was a bitter, sarcastic laugh, filled with disbelief and malice. "This is perfect, truly perfect. Wait until I tell everyone how my mother kicked me out of her house for daring to ask her for help. Wait until the family hears about this. Wait until Aunt Clara knows that generous Eleanor, the one who always has her doors open, has now become so selfish that she won't even help her own son." There it was, the veiled threat, the promise that if I maintained my decision, he would make sure everyone knew what kind of terrible, unfeeling mother I had become. That he would call my sister, my cousins, anyone who would listen, and tell them his meticulously crafted version of events. A version where he was the innocent victim, and I was the cruel, unreasonable mother who had abandoned him in his moment of need. For a second, I felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing against my chest. That automatic, deeply ingrained impulse to yield, to apologize, to say that it had all been a misunderstanding and that, of course, they could stay. That instinct that had been cultivated over decades of being the person who kept the peace, who avoided conflict at all costs, who sacrificed her own comfort and well-being to avoid being seen as difficult. But then I remembered something my dear friend Beatrice had told me 3 months before she died. We were sitting in her hospital room, the sterile air thick with the smell of antiseptic and fading hope. She had taken my hand, her fingers frail and barely possessing strength, and had looked at me with those tired eyes, that had seen too much of life's harsh realities. "Eleanor," she had whispered, her voice barely audible above the constant beeping of the machines. "The biggest mistake I ever made was worrying more about what people thought of me than what I thought of myself. I spent 70 years trying to be what others needed, and now that I'm dying, I can't remember a single moment when I truly lived for myself." Those words had been echoing in my head, a persistent, mournful refrain ever since her funeral. And now, standing across from my son and his implicit threat to destroy my carefully constructed family reputation, I understood that the moment had come to finally decide what truly mattered more: the fleeting image others had of me, or the profound, unassailable truth of who I really was. "Go ahead, Marcus. Call whoever you want. Tell them whatever you want. If your version of events is that you respectfully asked permission and I denied you help without reason, then so be it. But we both know that's not the truth. We both know you arrived here unannounced, assuming my house was your house, treating me as if my consent were utterly irrelevant." Marcus dropped the suitcase on the floor with a loud thump. His eyes were bright now, not with tears, but with pure, unadulterated rage. "You know what, Mum? You're right. I didn't ask permission. And you know why? Because I never thought I would have to ask my own mother for permission to stay in her house for a few days. Because I grew up believing that family helped each other unconditionally. Because you taught me throughout my entire childhood that the doors of this house would always be open to me." "I taught you wrong then," I replied, my voice unwavering, steady. "I taught you that love meant unlimited access, that being family meant I didn't have the right to say no. I taught you that my space was your space, and that my needs mattered less than yours. And now I'm correcting that mistake." Genevieve intervened again. And now there were real tears running down her cheeks, though I wasn't sure if they were from sadness, frustration, or perhaps a potent mixture of both. "Please, Eleanor, Marcus, let's all calm down. It doesn't have to end like this. We can find a solution." "We can't. There's nothing to solve, Genevieve. You need a place to stay. I need my space. Those two things aren't compatible. It's not complicated." Marcus picked up the suitcase again and walked toward the hallway, stopping right on the doorway threshold. He didn't look at me when he spoke, and his voice sounded different now, colder, more distant, stripped of all emotion. "When you change your mind, when you realize what you just did, don't expect me to come back as if nothing happened. Don't expect me to forget that you kicked me out when I needed you." "I didn't kick you out when you needed me, Marcus. I kicked you out when you decided that needing meant you could ignore me." He walked out into the hallway without saying anything else. Genevieve took the second suitcase, but before leaving, she turned around to look at me. Her face was red, streaked with tears, and there was something in her eyes that resembled genuine confusion, a complete lack of understanding. "I don't understand you, Eleanor. I really don't. What kind of mother does this? The kind of mother who finally learned that loving herself isn't an act of selfishness, it's survival." She shook her head, mumbled something I couldn't hear, and walked out into the hallway where Marcus was already waiting impatiently for the lift. I stood in the doorway of my apartment, watching them. Marcus's back was rigid, the posture of someone who felt deeply betrayed. Genevieve was checking her phone, probably frantically searching for nearby hotels on some app. The lift arrived with a soft, electronic chime. The doors opened. Marcus entered first, dragging his suitcase with a brisk, almost violent movement that made it hit the frame. Genevieve followed him, and just before the doors closed, Marcus looked at me one last time. He hadn't said anything, but the expression on his face said everything: disappointment, rage, a profound lack of understanding, and something deeper still. Something that looked like the genuine, unvarnished pain of someone who felt they had just lost something important. Part of me wanted to run to the lift, to stop the doors before they closed, to tell them to come back, that I was sorry, that they could stay. That deeply ingrained part of me that had spent decades learning to prioritize the emotional comfort of others over my own. That part that had been trained, meticulously and relentlessly, to believe that conflict was the worst possible outcome, worse even than my own unhappiness. But I didn't move. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching the lift doors close, listening to the mechanical, almost mournful sound of its descent, knowing that with every floor it descended, I was also closing a chapter of my life. I went back into my apartment and closed the door. The silence that greeted me was different from other nights. It wasn't the comfortable, chosen silence of solitude. It was the heavy, almost oppressive silence of consequences, of difficult decisions, of bridges I had perhaps just irrevocably burned. I walked toward the guest room, where Genevieve had so confidently begun to settle in. The clothes were still spread out on the bed. The toiletries were still lined up on the dresser. The laptop was plugged in next to the nightstand, its indicator light softly blinking in the room's dimness, a small, stubborn beacon of their assumed presence. I began to gather their things. I folded the clothes carefully, even though my hands were trembling slightly. I put the toiletries in a small plastic bag. I unplugged the laptop and placed it neatly on the bed, along with the other belongings. I didn't do it out of cruelty. I did it because I needed to reclaim this space. I needed it to stop being the place where someone else had unilaterally decided to set up without my permission, and return to being simply my guest room. Empty, yes, for now, but empty by my deliberate choice. When I finished, I left everything organized on the bed. If Marcus or Genevieve returned for their things, they would find them ready, respected, cared for, because that was the kind of person I was. Someone who could set firm boundaries without needing to be cruel. Someone who could say no without destroying what belonged to the other. I went back to the living room and sat in my armchair by the window. Outside, the evening was beginning to darken, the sky bruised purple. The lights in the neighboring apartments were turning on one by one, small, illuminated windows in the deepening twilight. I wondered how many of those windows held stories similar to mine. How many women were sitting in their own living rooms, grappling with the heavy weight of having finally set a boundary. How many were wondering if they had done the right thing, if the cost outweighed the gain. My phone vibrated in my sweater pocket, a sudden, jarring intrusion. I took it out and saw a text from Marcus. Just 3 words. Hope you're happy. I didn't reply because I wasn't happy. There was nothing joyful about what had just happened. There was no sense of triumph in having closed the door on my own son. There was no satisfaction in knowing that it would probably be weeks, maybe months, before we spoke again, before the raw edges of this wound began to heal. But there was something else, something that wasn't happiness, but that felt profoundly important nonetheless. There was clarity. There was the undeniable certainty that for the first time in decades, I had chosen my own dignity over the fleeting comfort of others. There was the quiet, profound feeling that I had recovered something I didn't even know I had lost. The right to say no without having to justify myself endlessly. Another message arrived. This one was from Genevieve. Marcus is very upset. I don't think he'll call you for a long time. I hope your pride is worth it. My pride? As if setting boundaries was a mere matter of pride. As if protecting my space was an act of vanity instead of self-care. As if the problem was my resistance and not their invasion. I turned off the phone. Not because I was running away from the consequences of my actions, but because I needed silence. I needed to process what had just happened, without the constant interference of messages designed to make me feel guilty, to undermine my resolve. I got up and went to the kitchen. The grocery bags were still on the table, exactly where I had left them what felt like hours ago, but had probably been only 45 minutes. I began to put away the groceries, moving on autopilot. The vegetables went into the refrigerator, the canned goods into the pantry. The artisanal bread was left in its usual basket on the counter. Every object found its designated place, and there was something profoundly comforting in that simple, predictable routine. Amidst the emotional chaos I had just endured, these small, tangible actions anchored me to something concrete and predictable. When I finished putting everything away, I made myself a cup of tea. I heated the water in the electric kettle, chose my favorite mug, that light blue ceramic one I had bought at a local market years ago, and watched as the chamomile leaves slowly expanded in the hot water, releasing their soothing aroma. The familiar scent enveloped me, and for the first time since I had opened the door to my apartment that afternoon, I felt like I could breathe completely, deeply. I sat down again in my armchair with the mug cradled between my hands. The gentle warmth of the tea transferred through the ceramic, warming my palms, a small comfort. Outside, night had completely fallen. The city continued its constant, indifferent rhythm, oblivious to the little drama that had just unfolded in my sixth-floor apartment. And then, without warning, I started to cry. They weren't dramatic sobs. It wasn't the heartbroken weeping of someone who had just lost something irreplaceable. They were silent tears that simply ran down my cheeks, slow and steady, while I remained seated, holding my tea, looking out into the darkness on the other side of the window. Tears, edshidki, that had been waiting decades for their turn to come out, for a moment of peace to finally claim their release. I cried for the mother I had been, that young woman who worked 2 shifts and came home so utterly exhausted she could barely stay awake to help Marcus with his homework. I cried for the years I had spent convincing myself that constant sacrifice was love, when in reality, it was just fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear that if I didn't give myself completely, utterly, my son wouldn't love me. Fear of ending up alone. And now here I was, alone anyway. But it was a different kind of solitude. It wasn't the bitter result of abandonment or rejection. It was the poignant consequence of having chosen my own dignity. And although it hurt, although it felt as if I had lost something important, there was also a strange, quiet sense of relief, like when you finally drop something heavy that you've been carrying for so long that you no longer even remembered how it felt not to carry it. I remembered a specific moment from when Marcus was 8 years old. It had been a particularly difficult day at my job at the coffee shop. A customer had yelled because his latte order had taken too long. My boss had unjustly scolded me for something that wasn't my fault, and I had come home with my feet so swollen I could barely walk. Marcus was in the living room watching television when I came in, engrossed in a cartoon. "Mum," he had said without looking away from the screen, his young voice a command. "I'm hungry." I had dropped my bags by the door, taken off my shoes that were mercilessly squeezing my sore feet, and gone straight to the kitchen to prepare him something to eat. I hadn't even sat down first. I hadn't even taken a moment for myself, because that's what good mothers did. Good mothers put their children's needs before everything else, without question, without hesitation. But what was I really teaching him with that behavior? I was teaching him that women existed to serve, that mothers didn't have boundaries, that saying, "Give me a moment, I'm tired," was selfishness instead of basic self-care. And now, 34 years later, my son had grown up believing exactly that. It wasn't entirely his fault. I had been his most consistent, unwitting teacher in that mistaken lesson. Every time I had ignored my own needs for his, every time I had smiled despite being utterly exhausted, every time I had pretended everything was fine when I was actually falling apart inside, I had taught him that I didn't matter as much as he did, and he had learned the lesson perfectly. I took a sip of my tea. It was already cooling, but the familiar taste comforted me anyway. I thought about Beatrice again, about those last conversations we had in the hospital. She had been so incredibly brave at the end, facing death with a brutal clarity that only came when there was no longer any time for comforting lies. "You know what's the saddest thing, Eleanor?" she had told me one afternoon while I peeled an orange to share with her. The citrus scent, sharp and fresh in the stale air. "It's not that I'm dying. We all die eventually. The sad thing's that I spent my whole life waiting for the moment when I could finally live for myself. When the kids grew up, when I retired, when I had more money, when. And now that moment is never going to come, because I ran out of time." She had squeezed my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until it's too late. If you need to say no, say it. If you need space, take it. If you need to choose yourself, do it, because no one else is going to do it for you." I finished my tea and left the empty mug on the side table. I sat in the silence of my apartment, listening to the distant, muffled sounds of the city. A car passed on the street below, its engine a low hum. Someone laughed in one of the neighbouring apartments, a brief, light-hearted sound. Life continued, indifferent to my little personal revolution. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a text from my sister, Clara. Marcus had already called her. Of course, the news of what I had done was already circulating through the family grapevine, spreading like wildfire. "Eleanor, what happened?" "Marcus called me very upset, saying you kicked him out of your house. He says they only needed to stay for a few days. Is it true? Call me when you can." I could perfectly imagine that conversation. Marcus, presenting himself as the misunderstood victim. Clara, always so diplomatic, trying to understand both sides, but probably leaning heavily towards sympathy for Marcus, because, after all, he was the family's son. And I, by extension, would be painted as the difficult, cold mother who had suddenly become selfish in her old age. I should have felt a surge of anger at the prospect of being so profoundly misunderstood. I should have wanted to call Clara immediately, to give my version of events, to defend myself, to make sure everyone understood that I wasn't the villain in this story. But I realized something important. It didn't matter as much as I thought it would. Because the truth was, Clara, despite being my sister and loving me in her own way, had never truly understood why I had allowed her to stay in my apartment for an entire year after her divorce. She had never recognized the immense sacrifice that had represented for me, the quiet, persistent erosion of my own peace. She had assumed, like everyone else, that I had plenty of space and plenty of time and plenty of energy left over, because that was what women like me had. Scraps of ourselves to distribute to whoever needed them. I wasn't going to call her, at least not that night. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the day after tomorrow. Or maybe never. Maybe it was time to simply let people think whatever they wanted to think. Maybe it was time to stop spending my precious energy trying to control the narratives others built about me. I got up from the armchair and walked toward my bedroom. As I passed the guest room, I took a quick glance. Genevieve's things were still there, neatly arranged on the bed. I would have to call Marcus tomorrow to tell him he could come pick them up whenever he wanted, but that was a problem for tomorrow, not for tonight. In my room, I changed slowly. I put on my most comfortable pajamas, that soft cotton set that was a little worn but felt like a warm hug. I washed my face, brushed my teeth, followed every step of my nightly routine with deliberate slowness, a ritual of self-care. Every action was a silent affirmation. This is my space. This is my time. This is my life. I got into bed and turned off the light. The darkness enveloped me, and with it came a thought I hadn't expected. Relief. Pure and simple relief. I wouldn't have to wake up early tomorrow because of the sudden noise of other people moving around my apartment. I wouldn't have to share the bathroom or wait my turn to make coffee. I wouldn't have to modulate my behavior or consider the unspoken needs of others before deciding what I wanted to do with my day. But along with the relief also came the weight of the pain. Because my son was angry with me. Because there was a palpable rupture in our relationship that I didn't know when or how it would be repaired. Because I had chosen my peace over his comfort. And that choice had consequences I would have to face, bravely and without apology. I allowed myself to feel both things at the same time. The profound relief and the deep pain. The certainty of having finally done the right thing, and the sadness of the consequences. The strength of having set boundaries, and the vulnerability of not knowing what came next. I closed my eyes and let sleep gradually arrive. Before falling completely asleep, I had a final thought. Maybe this was what it truly meant to grow up. Not when you formally became an adult, not when you had a job or a house or even a child, but when you finally learned that loving yourself wasn't selfishness. It was responsibility. It was justice. It was the only way to live with integrity. And with that thought, I finally let myself drift off to rest. I woke up the next day with the sunlight gently streaming through my bedroom window, painting soft stripes on the duvet. For a moment, in that hazy, peaceful space between sleep and waking, everything seemed normal, as it had for so many years. But then the memory of what had happened the night before returned with the force of a cold wave, a sharp, unwelcome jolt, and I lay there, looking at the ceiling, slowly processing the profound, undeniable fact that I had kicked my son out of my house. I got out of bed and followed my morning routine as I always did. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, brushed my teeth, and braided my greying hair. Every familiar action helped anchor me to the present, to remember that life, in its relentless momentum, continued despite the emotional drama of yesterday. But when I left my room and walked toward the kitchen, I couldn't help but look toward the guest room. The door was still ajar. Genevieve's things were still on the bed, neatly folded, waiting to be claimed. A silent testament to the evening's confrontation, I made coffee. The rich, invigorating aroma filled the kitchen as I took out my favorite mug and waited for the coffee maker to finish its work, the gentle gurgle a comforting sound. I poured myself a cup, added a little cream as always, and sat down by the living room window. Outside, Friday morning in London was in full swing. People were walking briskly to their jobs, a sea of commuters. Kids in school uniforms were on their way to school, their laughter echoing from the street below. The world kept spinning, completely oblivious to the small, personal earthquake I had experienced just hours before. My phone was on the side table where I had left it the night before. I turned it on with some apprehension, knowing there would probably be more messages. And there were. 3 more from Clara, each one more insistent than the last, tinged with a blend of concern and thinly veiled judgment. One from my cousin Isolde, asking if I was okay, in her typically blunt fashion. And then, one from Marcus that simply said, "I'm coming by this afternoon to pick up our things. You don't need to be here if you don't want to." I read that last message several times, trying to decipher the true tone behind the words. Was it consideration? Was it coldness, a deliberate distancing? Was it his way of giving me an out, of allowing me to avoid an awkward, potentially painful confrontation? I wasn't sure. But what I did know was that I wasn't going to hide in my own house. If Marcus was coming to pick up his things, I would be here. I replied with a simple, direct message. "I'll be here. Ring the doorbell when you arrive." I spent the morning cleaning. Not because the apartment was particularly dirty, but because I needed to keep my hands busy. to channel the nervous energy still thrumming through me. I vacuumed the entire living room, the rhythmic whir of the machine, a meditative hum. I wiped the kitchen counters until they shone, every surface gleaming under the morning light. I changed the sheets on my bed, even though I had changed them just 3 days earlier. It was physical therapy, a way to process the whirlwind of emotions still churning inside me, to assert control over the tangible when the emotional felt so volatile. Around noon, I finally decided to call Clara. Not because I felt I owed her an immediate explanation, but because she was my sister, and despite everything, I cared what she thought. I dialed her number and waited as it rang, a slow, deliberate chime. "Eleanor, thank goodness. I've been worried sick all night." Clara's voice sounded genuinely distressed, and something in me softened a little, a tiny crack in my armor. "Hello, Clara. Sorry I didn't answer sooner. It was a difficult night. Marcus told me what happened. Well, he told me his version. I want to hear yours." At least she hadn't automatically assumed Marcus was right, and I was wrong. I thanked her mentally for that small but significant act of faith before beginning to explain the situation, recounting the unexpected arrival of the suitcases, the lack of consultation, the escalating conversation, and how it had all culminated in my definitive request for them to leave. Clara listened in silence, interrupting only occasionally with clarifying questions, her tone thoughtful. When I finished, there was a long pause, filled only with the faint static of the phone line, before she finally spoke. "I understand why you felt that way, Eleanor. I really do. But don't you think you maybe overreacted a little? It's Marcus. He's your son. Surely you could have found a way to resolve this without actually kicking him out." There it was. The response I had been waiting for. The familiar, subtle suggestion that I had exaggerated, that I had taken things too far, that my reaction was somehow disproportionate. And maybe she was right. Maybe there were other ways to handle the situation, other diplomatic avenues I could have explored. But I also knew, with an unwavering certainty, that if I had given in, if I had allowed them to stay after they arrived unannounced, I would be teaching Marcus once again that my boundaries didn't matter, that my voice was negligible. I didn't overreact, Clara. I reacted appropriately. Marcus is 42 years old. He is an adult man with a stable job and enough resources to pay for a hotel. He decided it was more convenient to use my space without consulting me. That's not okay, no matter how much I love him. But that's just how families are, isn't it? We help each other when there's a need. We don't ask permission for every time we need something. I should have known Clara would say something like that. She had lived with me for a year, after all, during which time I had never charged her rent. I had never asked her to contribute significantly to expenses. I had never put a time limit on her finding her own place. I had been the generous, available, understanding sister. And now that I was finally setting boundaries, I must seem like a hypocrite, a betrayal of my own established pattern. "Do you remember when you lived with me after your divorce, Clara?" There was a noticeable silence on the other end of the line. "Of course, I remember. You were very generous to let me stay." Her voice was soft, laced with genuine gratitude. "Do you know why I didn't ask you to leave after a few weeks, or even a few months?" Clara didn't answer immediately, and I continued before she could formulate a response. "Because I was scared. I was scared that if I set boundaries, if I asked you to find your own place, you would think I was selfish, that I didn't love you enough, that I was a bad sister. So I swallowed my discomfort and my profound need for personal space, and I let you stay because that was what good sisters did. Eleanor, I didn't know you felt that way. You never said anything." Her voice was quiet, a whisper of regret. "Exactly. I never said anything. And that, Clara, was my mistake. Because by not saying anything, I taught everyone around me that I had no boundaries, that they could take what they needed from me without worrying about the cost to me. And now, after decades of doing that, I am finally learning to use my voice. And it hurts. It hurts to set boundaries. It hurts to disappoint people. But it hurts infinitely less than continuing to disappear in my own life. Clara sighed deeply, a long, drawn-out sound of contemplation. I don't know what to tell you, Eleanor. I understand what you're saying. I really do. But Marcus is very hurt. He's saying he's not going to talk to you for a long time. That's his choice, Clara. I'm not punishing him. I'm just protecting my space. If he decides that's reason enough to cut contact with me, then that says more about him than it does about me. We talked for a few more minutes, the conversation ending not badly, but also not leaving me feeling completely understood. Clara was a product of the same generation as me, raised with the same ingrained expectations about what it meant to be a good woman, a good mother, a good sister. It was difficult for her to truly understand why I was rejecting those deeply entrenched rules now, after having followed them so faithfully for so long. At precisely 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the doorbell rang. I got up from the sofa where I had been reading a novel, took a deep breath, steeling myself, and went to open the door. On the other side was Marcus, alone. There was no sign of Genevieve. He was carrying 2 large, empty canvas bags, probably to put the things they had left behind. "Hi, Mum." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was the voice of someone fulfilling an uncomfortable obligation, a necessary but unpleasant task. "Hi, Marcus. Come in." He moved past me without making eye contact and headed directly to the guest room. I closed the door and stayed in the living room, unsure whether I should follow him or give him space. I finally decided to remain where I was, but I left the guest room door in view, a silent monitor. I could hear him moving around the room, opening and closing drawers, the distinct sound of the bags zipping up as he packed their belongings. It took him about 10 minutes to pack everything. When he came out, he had both heavy canvas bags hanging from his shoulders, and his expression was still that carefully neutral mask. He stopped in the living room, halfway between the room and the exit door. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something important, that maybe this was the long-awaited opportunity for a real conversation, for a genuine bridge to be built. But instead, he simply nodded toward the hallway. "Can I use the bathroom quickly before I go?" "Sure." He dropped the bags next to the door, their soft thud echoing slightly, and went to the bathroom. I heard the water running, the familiar sound of someone moving around a space they knew well, every creak of the floorboards intimately known. And in that moment, the raw, unvarnished reality of what I had done truly hit me. Not the part about setting boundaries or protecting my space, that still felt unequivocally right, but the part about how my son, my only son, now felt like a stranger in the house where he had grown up, where he had taken his first steps. How he had to ask my permission to use the bathroom. How the emotional distance between us had grown so quickly, so profoundly in just 24 hours. He came out of the bathroom and picked up the bags again. He headed toward the door, and I followed him, my heart a heavy, persistent drum in my chest. He opened the door, stopped on the threshold, and finally he looked directly at me. His eyes, though still distant, held a flicker of something undefinable. "Is there anything you want to say, Mum?" There were so many things I wanted to say. I wanted to tell him that I loved him, fiercely and unconditionally. I wanted to explain to him one more time, with endless patience, why I had had to do what I did. I wanted to ask him if we could ever have a relationship again, a relationship where I was seen as something more than a convenient resource. But what came out of my mouth was something different, something imbued with a new resolve. "I love you, Marcus. I will always love you, but I am no longer going to sacrifice my well-being to avoid your discomfort. If that means we go a while without speaking, then so be it. But the door will always be open for a relationship where we both respect each other mutually. He nodded slowly, his gaze holding mine, as if processing my words, weighing their profound implications. He didn't say he loved me too. He didn't say he understood. He just nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible movement. "Goodbye, Mom. Goodbye, Marcus." The door closed behind him with a soft sound that resonated much louder than it should have in the sudden, echoing silence. I stood in that same spot for several minutes, looking at the closed door, listening to the absolute quiet that filled my apartment. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no voices, just a profound, empty silence. I walked back to the living room and sat in my armchair by the window. My hands were trembling slightly, so I clasped them tightly in my lap and took a deep breath, trying to calm my racing heart. I had done it. I had maintained my boundary, even when my son had come to pick up his things with that hurt expression on his face. Even when every fibre of my motherly being wanted to run after him, apologize, beg him to come back, to undo the irreversible. The following days passed with a strange, almost ethereal slowness. I woke up every morning and followed my routine. Coffee, shower, breakfast. But everything felt different now. There was a palpable weight in the air, a constant, low-level awareness that I had broken something. Although I wasn't entirely sure if what I had broken was my relationship with Marcus, or simply the dysfunctional, unspoken pattern we had maintained for decades. Clara called me twice more that first week, her tone shifting subtly with each call. On the second call, her voice was no longer just worried. There was something else there, a tentative vulnerability. "Eleanor, I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about when I lived with you after my divorce." I heard the sound of her taking a breath on the other end of the line, as if gathering courage for a difficult admission. "I never properly thanked you for that year. I never truly acknowledged what you sacrificed to give me space, to give me a haven. I just assumed you were fine with it, because you never said otherwise. But I should have asked. I should have been more considerate." I hadn't expected that apology. I felt something loosen in my chest, a tight knot I hadn't even known was there. "Thank you for saying that, Clara. It means a lot." "Maybe you were right about what you told Marcus," she continued, her voice softer still. "Maybe we all just assumed you would always be available, that you would always say yes, that you would never have your own needs. It's a hard truth to face." 2 weeks passed before I received the next message from Marcus. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a full conversation, just a photo. It was an image of him and Genevieve in front of what looked like their newly renovated apartment, the facade sparkling clean. The accompanying message simply said, "Renovations are finished. We're back home now." It didn't mention anything about what had happened. It didn't ask how I was. It was a cold, factual message, the kind of update you would send to a distant acquaintance rather than your mother. But it was something. It was a thin, fragile thread of communication, and I decided to take it for what it was, a small, tentative first step. I replied, "I'm glad you're comfortable in your space now. Take care." There was no reply after that. The days turned into weeks, then into a full month. I continued with my life, following the rhythm I had painstakingly built. I went to the organic market on Thursdays, as always. I met my friends, Ilara and Beatrice's sister, for coffee on Tuesdays. I devoured books I had been putting off for months, losing myself in stories. I spent whole afternoons sitting on my balcony, simply watching the city's pulse below, something I had never allowed myself to do, when I had always been waiting for someone to need me, to call me, to demand my time. And slowly, very slowly, I began to notice something profound. The heavy blanket of guilt I had been carrying, that constant, nagging feeling that I had done something terrible, something unforgivable, began to diminish. In its place appeared something different. It wasn't happiness exactly, not the buoyant, carefree kind. It was more like peace, a profound, settled calm, like the feeling of having finally put down something impossibly heavy after carrying it for so long that your arms had forgotten how it felt to be free. 1 month after the incident, I was at the market choosing the ripest, reddest tomatoes when my phone rang. It was Marcus. A real call, not just a text. My heart sped up, a sudden, familiar flutter, as I looked at his name on the screen. I carefully placed the tomatoes back in their crate and moved away from the bustling crowd before answering, my voice a little breathless. "Hello? Hello, Mum." His voice sounded different. It had lost that defensive edge, that weary impatience it had carried the last time we spoke. There was a vulnerability there, a tentative softness. "How are you?" "I'm fine, Marcus. And you?" There was a long pause. I could hear background noise, maybe traffic, a muffled city hum, as if he were walking down a busy street. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what you said." I didn't say anything, waiting patiently, giving him the space to continue, to say what he needed to say. "You were right, Mum. Not about everything. I still think you could have handled it differently, but you were right about the main thing. I arrived without asking. I assumed you would be available because you always have been, and that wasn't okay." His voice was barely a whisper now, filled with a quiet humility. I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been tight, constricted for weeks. A profound sense of release. "Thank you for saying that, Marcus. Genevieve and I have been talking, a lot. She says she's always felt like I take you for granted, that I treat your generosity as if it were an obligation instead of a gift. And I think she's right." I listened to the words come out of my son's mouth and felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would magically go back to how it was before, because I didn't want it to be how it was before, but the hope that maybe, finally, we could build something new, something more honest, something rooted in genuine understanding. "I appreciate you telling me this, Marcus. I know it wasn't easy. Mum, I'd like for us to get lunch together. Just you and me. No Genevieve, no pressure. Just to talk. Would you like that?" I surprised myself by smiling, a real, genuine smile that reached my eyes. "I would love that, Marcus. I truly would." We agreed to meet the following Saturday at a small, unassuming restaurant halfway between our apartments. When I hung up, I realized that tears were running down my cheeks again. But these were different from the ones I had cried that first night. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of the profound, unexpected possibility of healing. Saturday arrived, and I found myself nervous in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple, elegant brown dress that made me feel both comfortable and dignified at the same time. I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early and waited at a table by the window watching the passers-by. Marcus arrived exactly on time. He looked different, too. There was something in his posture, in the way he approached the table, that was more humble, less assertive than before. He sat across from me, and for a moment we simply looked at each other, a shared silence that felt less awkward than before, more meaningful. "Hi, Mom. Hi, son." We ordered food, and at first, the conversation was tentative, full of uncomfortable pauses. But gradually, as we ate, the words began to flow more easily. Marcus talked to me about his job, about the problems they were having with one of their projects, the complexities of navigating client demands. I asked him about Genevieve and how she was handling the stress of her own job, genuinely listening to his answers. And then, between the main course and dessert, Marcus put down his fork, his hands resting on the table, and looked directly at me. "Mum, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen completely before you reply." I nodded, feeling my stomach clench with anticipation. but also with a quiet readiness. My whole life, he began, his voice soft, thoughtful. I have seen you as my mother first, and as a person second. I never truly stopped to think about who you were beyond what you did for me, beyond your role in my life. And that was selfish. It was unfair. And I'm sorry. His voice broke slightly on the last words, and I saw that his eyes were damp, glistening with unshed tears. When you kicked me out of your house, I was furious. I thought you were being cruel, that you were punishing me for something I didn't understand. But after weeks of thinking about it, of talking with Genevieve, even of talking with a therapist I started seeing, I realized something. I realized that I have never truly asked you what you need. I have never considered that your life doesn't exist only in relation to mine, and that Mum has to change. Tears were running freely down my face now, and I didn't try to stop them. They were cleansing tears, tears of relief and understanding. I don't need you to be the perfect mother who always says yes to everything, he continued, his voice gaining strength. I need to get to know the real person, Eleanor, not just Mum. And if that means you sometimes tell me no, that you sometimes set boundaries, then I accept it. Because I'd rather have an honest, real relationship with you than keep living in this pattern where I take and you give until there's nothing left of you. I reached my hand across the table and took his. It was warm and a little shaky, a mirror of my own. Thank you, Marcus. You don't know how much it means to hear that. We spent the next 2 hours talking, truly talking, for the first time in what felt like forever. Not the superficial conversation we had maintained for years, but a real, vulnerable conversation about who we were, what we needed, how we could build a relationship that worked for both of us, that honored both our individual identities. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, difficult admissions, truths that hurt to speak aloud, but it was real. And that was infinitely more valuable than the false harmony we had maintained before. When we finally said goodbye at the restaurant door, Marcus hugged me. Not the quick, obligatory hug of family gatherings, but a real, long hug. The kind of hug that says, I see you, I value you, I love you for who you are, not just for what you do for me. The following months weren't perfect. There were relapses, moments when Marcus, almost instinctively, fell back into old patterns of taking my availability for granted. But the crucial difference was that now I had a voice, and he was learning to listen. I learned that teaching children respect doesn't end when they grow up. Sometimes, the most important lesson comes when you finally say no, when you finally set the boundary you should have set years ago. When you finally choose yourself without apology. Because being a mother doesn't mean being invisible. It doesn't mean sacrificing every part of yourself on the altar of maternal love. It doesn't mean your house, your time, your life are resources available to whoever needs them without your consent. Being a mother means loving deeply, fiercely. But it also means teaching your children that real love includes respect. That healthy relationships have boundaries, that you are also a person with needs, dreams, and the fundamental right to decide about your own life. That Thursday afternoon, when I found the rose gold suitcases at my entrance, wasn't the end of my relationship with my son. It was instead the difficult, painful, yet ultimately liberating beginning of a new relationship. One built on honesty instead of obligation. On mutual respect instead of unilateral sacrifice, on true love instead of dysfunctional patterns inherited from generations that mistakenly taught us women existed to serve. And when I sit now in my armchair by the window with my cup of hot coffee in my hands, looking at my quiet, tidy apartment, I feel something I hadn't felt in decades. Pride. Pride in having chosen myself. Pride in having found my voice. Pride in having taught my son that love doesn't mean the absence of boundaries, but the profound, essential presence of respect. My house is still my house. My life is still my life. And I, Eleanor Hayes, at 68 years old, finally own it.